everyone. Hi everyone, if you want to take a seat and get ready for the presentation, we'll start in a minute. It's on. Now is it on? It's on? We're good? You can hear me in the back? Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, well, hi everyone, and thank you for attending today's lecture. My name is Madison Polis, if you didn't know who I was, and I'm the director of the Harlan Lincoln House. I'm so excited to introduce our brown bag lecturer today, Paul Larson. Paul graduated with a bachelor's degree in philosophy and English from the University of Minnesota before attending Yale University, where he studied philosophy. Since then, Paul has worked as an independent historian and consultant with specialties in architectural history, research and writing, historic building and site documentation, interpretation and photography, and exhibit development and curation. Paul has been an executive director at the Gardner Museum of Architecture and Design, contributing editor of Architecture Minnesota, special curator of architecture at the University of Minnesota Art Museum, a guest curator at the Minnesota Museum of Art, and a restoration consultant and contractor. Paul has also written and contributed to several publications. He has received awards such as the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota Award for Great Houses of Summit Avenue in the Hill District, the Benjamin Franklin Honor Award for Mississippi Escapade, Reliving the Grand Excursion of 1854, the David Gebhard Award and Minnesota Book Award for Cap Wigington in Architectural Legacy in Ice and Stone, Midwest Publishers Award for A Place at the Lake, and several more. Paul has also designed, researched, and curated several exhibits, including the Island of Happy Days for Stout's Lodge in northern Wisconsin, a kaleidoscope of American architecture for the Gardner Museum of Architecture and Design, and Prairie School Architecture in Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. For the Minnesota Museum of Art. Paul is a member of several professional affiliations, including the Historic Preservation Commission Society of Architectural Historians. We are so happy Paul has decided to share some of his research with us today, so please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Paul Larson.
Thank you, Madison. I was afraid she was going to go through all 6 pages there. I come today to celebrate small houses. Not just small houses, but small, ordinary houses. You need me to talk, put my mouth on it. Is that better?
Yeah.
Or as they said in, what was it? Never mind. Men in Black. Is that better? Okay. Preservation consciousness has come very slowly to humble buildings, and particularly humble, unadorned buildings. In this country, preservation consciousness and activity really began with a rise in nationalism at the beginning of the 20th century, and with the leadership of the DAR and some other organizations, houses and buildings in general, but mostly houses that arose during the colonial period and the early federal period were preserved. Many of them became house museums, and that's sort of where preservation activity stayed for quite a while. It's the first big burst since then was the birth of the program for the National Register of Historic Properties in the mid-70s, and we began seeing some of the houses that had been despised by just the last generation of architects and historians and the public in general, the great Victorian monuments, the big houses and the banks, the courthouses, and in getting people's minds, that's sort of where preservation is today. We have historic districts that embrace a huge spectrum of houses of size and value, but individual properties, not so much attention. And that's when I and a few others like me entered the picture. I am deeply involved in what I guess you'd call probably the worst investments in real estate today, barns and small houses. You aren't going to make money out of anything you put into them. You do it out of pride, out of love for the building. And I hope today that when we looked at some pictures here, heard what I had to say, and discussed it a bit, that you will go out and position yourself in front of a small house and give it a moment of silence, or better yet, a moment of informed and appreciative silence. The slow roll is of just a scattering of small houses in southeastern Iowa. I have concentrated mostly on this county, what I could do with virtual tours, which have rather hazy photography sometimes over the internet, and then the work that I've done in Keosauqua, developing a brochure and doing an in-depth study of a wonderful trove of brick cottages. A lot of the most beautiful buildings here are in Keosauqua. So let me switch to another folder. So we start by tackling just some terminological questions. What is a folk cottage? Well, academic historians would probably call it a vernacular cottage or vernacular house. So that's the short answer. Not very illuminating, is it? How many of you are familiar with the term vernacular? A few of them. And in what context do you hear that word, vernacular? Language. It's the way people, the expressions they use, their syntax, sometimes their pronunciation. Y'all is Southern vernacular, you betcha is Upper Midwest vernacular. That's how we use the term. And the meaning for the term that attaches to those uses has everything to do with geography, the place where it is in the country or other countries as well, and long-held traditions. Now that works with architecture in Europe, where buildings have been built in a certain way out of local materials for hundreds of years until the mid-19th century when railroads and public transport got people and materials around. So you can talk about vernacular architecture of Sussex or of Puy-Dôme in France or any other places that have been around for hundreds of years. In this country, the small houses that we're dealing with were largely built by pioneers or second-generation residents in an area of the country that was completely alien to them. So they could bring little bits and pieces from the East with them, but they couldn't really exercise what we would call the creation of vernacular architecture. The only true vernacular architecture in that limited sense of vernacular was here already. It's what was done by all the Native Americans, the Hogans, and the teepees, and the Pueblo dwellings. That's the Western Hemisphere's type of vernacular architecture. So where do we go next? Well, we got another question. What might vernacular mean when applied to buildings, specifically American buildings? Hard for me to read. Okay, you look up Wikipedia, and this is the article. There's a very long article written by a very academically minded individual who thought that vernacular architecture was building done outside of any academic tradition and without professional guidance. Well, there are a lot of Italian and Gothic houses out there that are not done with professional guidance, unless you call the master builder who designed it and built it a professional, and architects are a little bit loath to do that. So that's a little bit too narrow. But it does allow him to say that over 95% of the world's buildings are vernacular. Well, all right, doesn't help us very much to get clear about it. Then there is I think an interior decorating site called the Spruce, at least that's, and this moves us a little closer. A modest style of building that is specific to a region and period. It relies on the use of local materials and knowledge to construct buildings. Well, that's a very British perspective where they had such things. But then we come to the Vernacular Architecture Forum, a wonderful organization that brings together experts in architecture and history, just looking at vernacular buildings. I don't think you'll find a definition of vernacular on the site. They're on their internet site. They realize that what they're really just talking about is ordinary architecture, everyday buildings, buildings with additional plans and common materials. We could add buildings without ornament. So they're the kind of buildings that are most easily overlooked, the last to draw any kind of preservation attention. So let's look at some of the floor plans that distinguish vernacular buildings, vernacular homes in particular. Oh, I guess we also need to talk about why all this is important. The rarity in itself makes them somewhat important. They are, in a sense, extraordinary because they are so ordinary. They're so ordinary, nobody paid attention to them. So we have few of them left, and they become rather extraordinary. Historical richness as well. They often signal the beginnings of modern settlement. Many of them were the places where town leaders, regional leaders would be born and raised, like Lincoln's log cabin in Salem, Illinois. And then they also have a wonderful capture of pre-industrial or primitive industrial technologies. A lot of them were constructed of timber. There was not timber that was sawn on site because of the lack of a good sawmill nearby. A pit saw takes two people. You dig a long pit, put the log into it, and one person pops into the pit, the other one is up above, and they have this humongously long saw that they go back and forth and cut the timbers. Very laborious operation, but it's captured if you were to get an X-ray by a lot of these buildings. The simplest one is simply called a hall house, or a single pen house, or a single cell house. Those sound a little bit jarring, but hall house is just fine. Hall in England means room, not just what we think of as a hallway. Just a simple house with a single door. This one happens to be centered. You can see it's not large enough to have more than one room. This one survives only because it is the sort of remnant of a larger house. The rest of the house was not built of brick, and it just kind of got taken down a piece at a time, and I have no idea whether this building is viable at all, who owns it. It's in Bonaparte. So that's the single of the hall house. Then there's the hall and parlor, and a lot of these you'll see are completely symmetrical, but you can't put from the outside, but you obviously can't put a wall right where the door is, so it's off to one side, and that room is the hall, and the one to the right is the parlor. The hall is where all the family's activities were taking place: kitchen, the dining area, and sleeping quarters. And the parlor is for doing up nice for the visitors, and for the family just to relax. That's a building outside of Salem. That's actually on the National Register, one of 52 buildings in the county on the National Register. Then there's the Central Passage House, sometimes rather pretentiously known as the Georgian plan. Very, very common during the Georgian period, the late neoclassical period on the East Coast. But for a one-story house, it just means that there's a hall that goes straight back from the door, and then it branches off on either side, and there are no rooms behind. This is a rare survivor of that. If you want to enlarge the house, generally they would keep the sides intact because that's where the light comes in, and just string it out behind that. If it goes on long enough, it becomes a shotgun house where you can shoot through the front door and goes through the living room and the dining room and hits the turkey on the kitchen stove. We don't have any of those here. Quincy has a great many of them. At least I don't know of any in this county. Can you all hear me well enough? Good. Then there's the pair house. This is just a guess on my part that that's what's going on here because of the distance between the door and the windows. Where that entry hallway or passageway is actually a room in itself. And historically, that room is where the kitchen and dining area would have been. So then you have the bedrooms on one side and the living room on the other. Or you can have that central hall, all the living area, and then bedrooms on either side. So you see how this would grow a somewhat larger family, or house a larger family. Double cell house. When you first look at these, they sort of remind you of churches that had two entrances, one for men and one for women, back in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But normally they weren't duplexes. They were just two doors into the two rooms. They could, however, obviously house two small families. By the way, a lot of the families that lived in these small houses had 6 and 8 children, so they were stacked together. Then a somewhat larger house, we get into the double pile house. Strange term, but that simply means that it's 2 rooms deep. The one on top shows just a single room, and you see why it's there. It's so that they can get upstairs to the attic. There wasn't room within the house itself to really have a comfortable staircase, so they put an addition on it, which would be probably the kitchen, and then you can go all the way to the back of the kitchen and go up the stairs. That tells us that that was probably, even as a small building like this, maids' quarters. Otherwise, why would you enter the staircase at the very rear of the building? So it's not a show staircase, it's just a functional way of getting to the upper floor. The lower building is the village's offices in Kiyosakura, a wonderful old building. Here are some more examples of double pile architecture that can become quite elaborate. And you see the elaborate frieze and columns in front. This sort of pushes in a stylistic direction, or at least in ornamentation. And that's one of the things that often happens with these small cottages. It's gone, a lot of it's gone away now. They'll just have little bits of ornamentation. And that pushes a lot of architectural historian over the, well, I won't say over the edge, but that makes them force the house into some style or another, into some high style. I don't think that's appropriate. This is still just a folk cottage with a little bit of improvised decoration that could be from any style at all, but doesn't really set a style for the house. There you can see the possibility of 2 rooms on the side, but more likely a single room on either side, and then an addition in the back for the kitchen. So that's a double pile. Here's another example of one of those double penthouses with a door on either side. Wonderful condition. This one's in Bonaparte as well. Excuse me,
I can get it.
What is that? Sure. So we stay with it here. This, I believe, is the French Creek House in the only one in Lee County that I'm showing, which has a really interesting history. The front left quarter of it was built in 1844. Then the front right was built, then the back left, then the back right. And it happened over a 40, 50-year period. So it really documents how technology had changed and available material had changed over that period. This is one of my favorites, this little single pen cottage in front. And in order to access the back stairs, they originally would have had an exterior staircase, but they had closed it in this, well, what would have been octagonal, you had all the sides there, addition. And then there's another addition behind that, and another addition behind that. So this little cottage kept on growing. And it wasn't just to accommodate a growing family, because this was done over a 40-year period. Another really common style that is not talked about very much is a side hall double pile, where entry is from one side or the other. It's usually the left for some reason. Staircase right behind the door that would lead up to upstairs, and then the kitchen behind, living room in front, dining room behind on the right. Very economical and useful plan. You see the little bump out on the right? I've seen that in building trade books from the 1850s and 60s, but in my experience, almost all of them were little kits you could get around 1882, 83, 84 to give you a window seat in the dining room or the living room. Just plop it onto the side of your house. Pretty spendy for what you get out of it, but it did bring in a lot more light, and what a wonderful place to sit. This is a house in right in town here, on the corner of, I think I got this down somewhere. Well, maybe I don't. Anyway, it's on a street corner, and you look at the two facades that normally would have had a door. There is none. Also look at the shallow arched windows, which is a way of giving this a later date. This is probably from 1890, which is kind of the end of the period when we get all these vernacular cottages. And it ends up that this was a side hall cottage. You can see the top, the fanlight above the window, sticking above the roof of the addition to the back. That's where the initial entry was. So it was a very unusual way of egressing the house. The porch roof that extends toward us would have been a later addition. You can kind of see how that little gable roof behind might have been very, very early.
Location is Sanders and Jackson.
That's it. Thank you. And you say Sanders, not Saunders.
Saunders. I'm not from here.
Oh. Sanders as a pronunciation of Saunders. Maybe that's
No, it's really
Tennessee
Saunders.
vernacular or something. Okay.
I say Saunders when I'm thinking of
Yeah, some say tomato, some say tomato. We're not going to talk much at all about pyramid houses because they're from a later period. But they're interesting structures. You see them everywhere, and a lot of them are in fairly decent condition. If you think of the pyramid house as one of those 4 square houses where all the sides are about the same size, and then just 2 stories tall, they're everywhere. You just cut off the ground floor and lower the top floor down, and you get a pyramid house.
it. It's cheaper.
It's cheap. And this one has 24-inch blocks along the side, which gives it a somewhat early date. Obviously, concrete block puts it into the 20th century. But it's a rather, I would say, midstream chronologically pyramid house. And they could do planning the way you wanted. By this time, people's plans were largely tailored to individual preferences. Now we get into Mount Pleasant houses, just 3 of them that are on Henry. You can see it has some modern stuff going on in front and some modern stuff on the side. Vinyl siding, very common. And you can also see by where the door is relative to the windows that there was probably a fanlight above the door, whose main purpose was to bring illumination into that side hall. Look how tall the windows are. Here's another one. I'm sorry for the haziness of the picture, but it's the best I can get off of GIS. This is a brick house. Quite a magnificent porch wrapping 2 sides of it. More modern dormers that actually would be necessary in order for that upper space to be functional. It's so narrow. And this,
Would you say those dormers were added?
yeah, I would say that they were probably added. A lot of times early houses like this just had a very simple single room upstairs, and if they wanted to expand the utility of the room, they would need to put dormers on. It's possible they're original, but I rather doubt it because of the age of the house. By the way, if you get into the GIS site or look directly at assessor's records, there are a whole lot of houses that say 1900. And what that means is older than 1900. instead of hazarding guests. This is a great little pyramid house, I think on Adams, with a little knocked-in re-entrant angle porch and a lattice, which was very common in its day. And for some reason they, well, you can pretty much see that the whole front part of the house is an addition that includes the porch because the roof acquires a different slant. So here's somebody that is trying to hold on to an older house and just making it more suitable for their purposes. I think we're in Jefferson Township. I'm having a hard time remembering what we see. What is that? We got off again. This is not obeying me. I'm sorry, we've got off again. Are you moving your hand above
No,
yourself?
I haven't touched it.
Even without touching it.
Just a ghost.
No, I haven't been anywhere. It's not me.
Robert, you're not a bad person.
Thank you.
But I technology. This is the house on Adams here in town. Quite an old house that I can't date by looking very well. It has stone lintels on it, so there was a little bit of expense involved. And you see the wide frieze that the board runs on top. It's associated with Greek Revival, so somebody would probably call it Greek Revival, but that to me is not enough. But again, a dormer edition, this one a rather awkward one. Notice the well, not,
It's the siding. It's the siding.
Yeah. Well, or brick it probably wouldn't be there anymore. Notice the original attic window has a Gothic head on it.
Yes.
Again, this is why I don't think it's appropriate to classify any of these houses stylistically. They just grab bits and pieces from whatever was current and whatever they can afford. You can see that upper, the Gothic arched window is tucked right up against the frame. So, okay, let's see if we go. Okay, now we're getting outside of Mount Pleasant. This house is in Jefferson Township. Like almost all of them, once you get out of this township, they earn the assessor's date of 1850. This one is a little bit peculiar in that it has that blank side that suggests a staircase, but they always put the staircase in a rather awkward position relative to the door, so I'm not sure what was going on there. It is quite possible that that could indicate an attachment to a wing at one time.
How thick are the walls?
It's variable. If it's a well-built house, the walls will be 2 bricks thick, and with a spacing between that usually comes to 11 to 14 inches, depending on the brick and the space. But they're rather thick. And that's one way that you can get at the original interior plans, or whether there were additions. When you have a super wide wall inside, then you know that the house itself is much smaller than just added to. They were very, very skilled at making early additions and lacing brick in using the same brick and doing it seamlessly so you can't really tell. A lot of the early houses were built with local brick. It was before the railroads brought them in from Chicago and St. Louis. So that local brick would have been available for as long as the shale pit on the property or close to the property was still being worked for clay. All right. Here's another hazy one from the township, near Wayland, from Jefferson Township, near Wayland. Okay. Should have a little thing that goes on. Now we're in Salem Township. This house is on the National Register because it was so pristine at one time. Curiously, the archival photograph that appears with it is either of a different elevation or a different house. Because it has 3 windows instead of 2. It's a little tough. So I'm thinking that maybe what we're looking at in the modern photograph is the rear end of the house. And the show house is up above with that very fancy hand-hewn picket fence. It'd be wonderful to have a picket or 2 as a relic. I'm not sure I'd want the fence. Okay. This is another one that is dated 1900. We know it's much, much older than that from 2 things. One is the height of the windows relative to the width, and the other is the very simple porch. The porticos of the early houses were in this neck of the woods, or the soybean fields, were seldom gable. They just had a flat roof. It could be pimped, that is slightly slanted to drain, or it could be like this, just flat. My house in Keosauqua, I rebuilt the roof, took out the gable roof that was large enough to drive a hearse under, and put a much simpler roof on it that would have been more like the original. I could see from the framework that there was a roof like that. But like a lot of people who are restoring older houses, I did some decorative touches there that would have been verboten if I had really been doing a literal job. Those posts would have been 6x6s with the edges chamfered, so that they would have this kind of hollowed out area up and down on all 4 sides of the posts. These are salvage posts from a colonial revival house from the 1920s, and I thought they looked fairly sharp, so so put them up. The house is unusual in that it has side lights, the windows on either side of the door, but no fan light. And most of these older houses we're looking at had fan lights, but no side light. So this showed that it had a wider entry hall that would accommodate that. Okay. This is the side of the house to show that even back in the 1840s and 50s, the oldest parts of the house date to 1840, there was an effort at doing something remotely stylistic. That gable return on the left and has a wide block under it. If this were really Greek revival, underneath that block under it would be a pilaster. But if you put that wide piece of wood in the corner, you couldn't fit the window in. So they just did that little decorative touch. And then when they added the porch in the back and changed the outline of the roof, the slope of the roof, they did a gable return that's 8 or 9 feet long from right to left. You can't see it very well, it's the dark green area. And then when the house was moved onto a foundation and given a full basement, a new foundation given a full basement, they put shutters on it, reflective of, and painted it white, so reflective of colonial revival. So the house, as it is today, reflects several generations of thinking about what a stylish house would look like. And I didn't give it a restore date other than the 1906 when it was raised and they put on the shutters, just to capture that wonderful 60-year history that preceded that.
Where is that?
It's right behind the hospital in Keosauqua.
Okay.
So were shutters originally to protect the glass, or were they always just stylish?
They were protective, and they would also darken the interiors. These curiosities, the windows are so close together that they cannot accommodate shutters. So what they did originally was put a shutter on the right side of each window, and then on the left they just put the shutter over to the corner. It looks very strange. I like history, but I won't go quite that far. So I shuttered the middle window completely and the others just on the sides to at least give an impression. The prior owner removed all of the original wood shutters, which were quite wonderful, but half of them had rotted. And now we are seeing the pleasures of vinyl. The house was badly damaged in a hailstorm a few years back, which gave me the opportunity of tearing the vinyl off and seeing what the bones of the house really were like, seeing in a really conspicuous way when additions had happened, and just, capture all of its weekly history. I mean, you look at there's not a straight line on the bottom. The siding kind of goes up and down because the house went up and down. All of that, by the way, happening since World War II. The house was in flawless condition before it was left empty during the war. Okay. This is what happens when a cottage decides to go a little bit stylistic. Gothic cottages are distinguished by having these very tall, narrow gables. And then you see the affectations of the Gothic style above the windows. So this could be called a Gothic cottage. The porch, I'm not sure about the supports, they're very fancy, but the porch roof itself is probably original. They're early hip roofs on, I should say the early porch roofs normally, when they went the width of the house, would be hipped like that. They wouldn't go all the way to the edge on top and just be a straight slope down. They'd be hipped on either side. All right. Another small house that's unusual. unusual. This again dated 1900. It probably is later because it's a little bit larger in size. It has the 2 upstairs windows. And what is happening inside, I have no idea. It's much wider than houses of that type. It's quite possible, because of the steep slope of the roof, that this was a little Gothic cottage too. But now we call it vernacular because it's ordinary. Okay. Here you see the fan light I was talking about above the door. Something that continued in use right through the early 20th century. Great way to bring light into the hall. So just on the basis of how this house looks, it could have been built anywhere between 1870 and 1910.
So that thing,
Pardon?
that thing over the door, what do you call it?
It's a
I thought it was a
fan
transom.
light. It's called a fan light.
Fan light.
Yeah, they call the windows around the door lights because they brought light in.
Yeah.
So that's the fan light. The side lights would be on either side.
But a lot of the old houses are made with a transom, which would let air go from one room to
Right.
another with the door shut.
Right, and that is normally, the transom light is normally an interior feature to ventilate. Both, it does 2 things. It brings air through the house and the corridor, and it illuminates the corridor, so you get shared light. As a rule, the fan light on the outside is not operable as fixed glass, but there probably are some examples of it being operable too. Okay. I believe we're moving on to Winfield here, and again, you have a wonderful original porch, as I described it, with a hipped roof rather than just a shed roof. Okay. Contrast that with a house that's probably after the turn of the century. You have a double window upstairs, the paired window. You have a porch roof that runs all the way to the edge in a straight line with a somewhat problematic relationship to the windowsill up above if you had deep snow. And you have a little pedimented gable just stuck on in front. A little remnant of Queen Anne, just hanging on there. But again, not really something that gives the house a nameable style. It's just a little piece stolen from popular architecture of the period. But very tall, narrow windows. This is one of my favorites. It captures so much history. The original house is probably the 3rd segment of the house, and the reason we can tell that is that the addition in front of it butts right up to the side of the window. That probably would not have been done originally. Then you get the tall windows that could be from the 80s or 90s, and then you get the front end that really does have a bit of stylistic character. It has ionic columns, a geometrical design in the window, but still unclassifiable. Progressively fancier and more expensive pieces of the house coming forward. Normally, the old house is in front and all additions go behind. This is interesting for coming towards the street. Sorry. Now I just want to dance through some of Keosauq's brick cottages. I have a brochure that any of you can pick up. A somewhat limited number of them here, but you can send more down if you're interested. I'm showing the map just so you can see how many brick folk cottages there are in Keosauq. It's really, really unusual. These are arranged in chronological order. This one dates to 1849. You see the tall windows. The metal roof was obviously, but blue is not an uncommon color for composition roofs, so the second roofing might have been that, but the first roofing was, of course, shingles. Sometimes not cedar. If they couldn't find cedar, any wood that you could split could be used for the roof. You can see the fine detailing up along the rakes of the gable, and again continuing on from the hip roof of the porch. A little bit of ornamental work that was done by a skilled mason, and again shows no style, just a little bit of fancy stuff added in.
When do you think those returns would have been done? Or was that,
Which
the returns on either side of the porch there, above the porch roof?
Those were I'm sure original. Is there something there that makes them look?
I'm just learning.
The reason I think they're original is that they kept the dental pattern in the brick,
Yeah.
so it continues. But
It's
really unusual because that block there is associated with Greek Revival, which has a pilaster under it. And there's nothing Greek Revival about those little doodads sticking down from the return,
Right.
the dentals. Instead of true dentling, which is rectangular, a lot of them use a sawtooth pattern by setting the brick diagonally. And that's what most of the folk cottages do that have that at all. Okay. She's much better at getting these slides to move forward than I was. This is an 1852 house that gives away its association with early Gothic Revival cottages. The Gothic Revival and Italian cottages both began being built in the 1840s with Alexander Jackson Downing and others that published little books that gave floor plans and drawings of how the exterior might look. But if you think of this as a jump from Greek Revival, which was all very rectilinear and strict, and now suddenly you've got this crazy witchy top to the house, and it sheds snow well enough, but doesn't allow for much living space upstairs. The porch is a 1920s addition, portico, commonly there just to provide protection against the elements. It probably would have had one of those little bent roofs like I put on my house originally. Okay, next. Another house from about the same period. I love this house because it has ornamental architraves. Well, I'm not that tall. The top of the windows is highly carved. So the fellow who owned this house was a cabinet maker. Again, not to echo a style of any kind. It was just something that he was interested in doing. And then you see the wavy balusters on the porch. That's not warping, that's just how they work. Unfortunately, this porch is falling off. A lot of the houses I documented 4 years ago are losing their porches already. But probably not a double file house, just a single room deep. There's very narrow windows on the side. Again, extra expense, no extra light. Could have just had a wide window, but wanted to do something that he thought was ornamental. This is an interesting piece. Again, you see the blocks that are sort of gable returns, but not really, and in this case, just on one side. This house was actually a law office. That's how it was built, but it looks like a little brick residential cottage. The original owners went on to become some of the most prominent architects, lawyers in the state. One of them became Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. But this is how they began. Common pattern for windows, you see when you have a tall window, the lower one, which was the only movable part, is a little bit smaller than the upper. Local limestone trim, limestone that can take a finish, and then crude limestone rubble for the foundation. This is an interesting house that shows the sawtooth decoration on the rakes. So plainly it was a brick house, but now it's aluminum. Quite unusual to see a clad house made of brick. When I was running the Architecture Museum in Quincy, it was all I could do to keep people from putting vinyl over their brick houses. For really no reason at all. They needed, if they wanted to steal the house, they needed to tuck point it. And they were small enough that it could have been done economically. But keeping up with the Joneses, I guess. I love this little house because I had initially thought that it was a new addition behind, or an addition behind, and then this brick house in front. These are all bricks, by the way. But it ends up that that's a wood frame addition. The patio doors obviously are not historic. But the kitchen was a wood frame addition onto the old house, and there's enough shared timber that it was plain that that's how it was originally designed. So the part of the house that is no subject to fire, you make out of wood. Well, again, a more recent portico to the front. I like the way they imitated the slope of the main roof, but the original would have been just a simple shed roof. And one of everybody's favorite buildings in Quincy is where the Villages of Van Buren offices are. It belongs to the Historical Society, which is taking excellent care of it. And here is the original house is very difficult to date, but I believe it dates to post-Civil War, around 1868. That's when arched windows started being used, brick arches, and it has that fancy pedimented door. Not quite enough to make it Greek revival, but you kind of get the idea. One of the curiosities of the house is that it doesn't have, the upstairs windows are very limited, and it isn't finished upstairs, in spite of the fact that there was a family living here, so, as well as the offices. So I'm not sure whether the kids got stuck up there in that little space or crowded together downstairs. But a wonderful building with local brick. This one is on the cover of the brochure I developed on brick cottages in Kisakwa, and really railing. Notice the real simple neoclassical design. Probably a replacement because of that degree of detail. The house itself dates to 1871, and most likely just had straight posts, maybe with chamfered edges. But these very elegant, slender columns were popular colonial revival elements between 1900 and 1930. And I guess that's when that was made.
And neoclassical dog.
Oh yeah, neoclassical dog. I had to move things around in Photoshop on that one. The dog was really badly positioned. I didn't want to kill the dog, but they tried to push. Another house with, again, an echoing portico. The roof line imitates the main lines of the gable. And you look, if your eye follows the left side of that house, you can see it's in severe trouble.
Have walls leading in?
It's leaning and sunken at the same time. And since the issues with the foundation, it's the kind of reason that these houses come down, even just with somebody who cares about it, because the cost of fixing that foundation would probably be half the cost of the house's worth when it was done. This one is unusual for not having a large addition. It just has a small kitchen addition behind. But again, the tall windows. And probably a little more elaborate ventilation upstairs at one time. It's been covered with wood since then. I love this little affair with the arched windows that betray a somewhat later date, around 1880. It has the distinction of probably never having been lived in by the original owner. He got married, and there was something going on between him and his family that he moved. He advertised himself as a doctor for 2 years, and then he wasn't. So, strange happenings, but a wonderful, wonderful house with a very 1920s portico over the doorway of the house itself, dating to around 1880. I love the pair of chimneys as well. One of them looks like it's going to go right down behind that window. So don't quite know what was going on. Another favorite house of mine with a more modern bump out, possibly, but no, this is 1890, so that could easily have been original, that little bump out for the living room, which would have been a very narrow and deep window seat. Again, notice the brick arch over the windows and the side hall plan. Really wonderful little house. It's high on the lot. So that, I believe, ends the show, and I do hope that you do notice some of these little houses and give them a moment of reflection. Salem has a lot of them, more visible from the street than the houses here in Mount Pleasant, and more kind of holding on, multiple layers of siding, some changes. But it's worth a look. Salem is a wonderful little town, as is Mount Pleasant. I in no way mean to badmouth the drive up Main Street past all those magnificent Victorian houses. That's where preservation energies have been spent, and you can see why. But look around at the little guys, too.
If there's any questions?
Hi, I have a question about, that you may not be able to answer, about my grandmother's house in Jefferson County.
Oh, I know that one.
It has a kitchen that was either added to the house or the house was added to the kitchen. And the reason why we were always amazed by the kitchen is that it's a small space, but there's not a nail in it. It's all held together with wooden pegs. So what the heck is going on with that?
How old is the house itself, do you know?
It's really old, but I don't know how old. It was old when my grandmother bought it in 1930.
Well, if that has paid construction too, which means probably...
No, the house doesn't, just the kitchen.
Well, then the kitchen was first, yeah. It could have
really
been...
small.
It could have been the summer kitchen for another house that was replaced. So
Okay.
that house might be the new house from, 1890 or something.
So why did they use wooden pegs? Or when was the time? Why
That-
did they use nails?
The early houses were before the balloon frame that all of us are familiar with, 16-inch on center studs. Before that, houses were built with a post and beam system, which meant 4x4 or 4x6 posts, usually 4 feet apart, and then you nail siding in between and maybe have a middle support that was just there to hold on to the siding. And nails, the two reasons for not using nails was that they weren't regarded as permanent because they rust, and a lot of the houses were built of wood that really wouldn't accept a nail. My house is solid walnut. Everything is walnut. So the only way to attach members is with a mortise and tenon joint where one member fits inside another, and then drive a peg through all of that with a hand auger and then a wooden peg. And that lasted for a long, long time. Oh, I'm sorry, I got away from the mic. I have seen houses, and I've seen barns from the 1920s that still do that. So that was one of the reasons was the fact of poor penetration. But another one connected to that is that we don't have any pine around here. And we waited for pine to come up the river or down the river or be delivered by the railroads before we could build houses that would be nailed together. There was a distrust for a long time of balloon framing because it was thought that they would rack, like this. And they are dependent entirely because they don't have bracing, except during construction. They're dependent on the rigidity of the sheathing. The outside wood that covers them is what keeps them from going like this in the wind. A post and beam house has struts or braces at all the corners and sometimes midway in the house too. So it's regarded, and rightfully so, as an extremely sturdy means of construction. A tornado, if it came through, would not tear apart a house like that. It would just lift it off the foundation. So there is something to that. But of course, it became harder and harder to find, get those big timbers, and if you're not cutting them in your backyard, the pit saw, they're pretty pricey, and not everybody could do it. A carpenter with very little training can put up the frame of a balloon frame house. So that transition, the balloon frame was invented in the late 1840s in Chicago and spread throughout the country really not very much until after the Civil War, and that's when we begin getting a lot of balloon frame houses. But in rural areas like this, you continue to see the post and beam houses right through the 70s and 80s. So that's a long answer to your grandma's house.
Thank you.
A couple of good questions are already raised here. Does anybody have another? Well, you've been a great audience. Appreciate it. I do have some copies of the folk cottages of Keosauqua here if anybody is interested.
And I just want to make a quick announcement. Next week we will have Jeff Meyer, a historian and Iowa Wesleyan archivist, and he will be presenting, did you hear about the lady lawyer, telecommunications, railroads, and information transmission in 1869. And if you're interested in supporting the Harlan Lincoln House today, we do have our donation box out, and we also have membership brochures if you're interested in becoming a member and are not already one. I'll also be around if you have questions. And Mr. Kropa has a quick announcement also.
Yeah, this is a teaser for next time. So picks up your schedule so you can stay a little later. We have the soloist with the symphony, the tuba player, and she'll come in just as this thing is over next time to just entertain you a little bit. So if you can kind of work yourself out where you can stay a little longer, that'd be cool. Yeah. Okay.